I want to really focus on today is really what are some of the fundamental basic principles of a democracy. Now, this may be a throwaway question, I might as well throw it out there. What is absolutely essential for a democracy to function? If you don't have this, you're not a democracy, right? Don't even try to convince me that you're a democracy. You need elections, but more to the point, what kind of elections do you need? Free and fair elections, free and open elections, okay? It's so obvious at this point, the answer is also cliche. But I want to get that point across. Free and fair elections get you in the door, right? This is democracy 101. You can have a lot of other stuff, but if you don't have elections, you don't have a democracy. Now, the best way to cover this important aspect of free and fair elections is to look at one of the basic definitions of that. And here we go back to one of the major texts within the field. This is Joseph Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which pretty much lays the definition bare. Okay? The basic conception of a democracy is one in which there is an institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for people's votes. If you want the academic definition, there it is. Okay? I told you, the first part of this class, a whole bunch of origin stories. Okay? This is it. Okay? Schumpeter is laying bare what was already self-evident, in that in order for a democracy to function, the primary element, the critical element, is the presence of free and fair elections. The ability for people within that state to contest the leadership and the quality of that leadership of people in power, and if necessary, vote them out. Or if they do a good job, to keep voting them back in. Okay? But we are talking about a competitive struggle for people's votes. Now that brings up one additional thing. Because are there, and again, I asked this question on Monday, but it's worth repeating again. Are there states today that have elections that are not democratic? Absolutely, there's tons of them. Okay? So the second thing that we need, beyond free and fair elections, it's kind of hidden within that definition. But you kind of need this in order for free and fair elections to kind of be taken seriously. What do we need? What do you need? What do we need for free and fair elections to be, free and fair? Well, okay, you definitely need, who are you voting for, or better yet, what are you voting for? People to go into a government, that much is true, yes. But there's something else.
Competition between parties.
Yes, very good. You need competition. You need to have at least two political parties. Right? There are plenty of countries in the world today that have elections, and I would even go so far as to say that they are, at least by their own configurations, free and fair. I mean, Chinese elections. There are elections in the People's Republic of China. Remember, it's the Communist Party, the Communist Party, the Communist Party. Are they free and fair? I mean, by all measures of single-party dictatorship, sure. But in order for it to be a democracy, you need to have at least one other political party. Right? There's got to be some kind of competition. And, equally important, both parties need to be under the assumption that they could lose this election. Right? This is not just simply a given. So even if there is an opposition party, the opposition party needs to actually be legit and not just a show horse, if you understand what I'm saying. Right? There can be opposition parties that just simply go through the motions and, oh, look at that, they lose. So you need to have at least two competitive political parties, right? Absolutely. Now, as I just mentioned, elections are what a democracy begins with, but it is not what a democracy makes. In other words, elections get you in the door. But if that were the end of our discussion, this class would only be about 2 weeks. Obviously, there is more than just simply elections. And Lindsay-Stepan, the very same Lindsay-Stepan that if you didn't read today, definitely have read for Monday, point out what is, at this point also very obvious, the notion of electoral fallacy. The electoral fallacy is that assumption that if there are elections in the country is democratic. That is not the case. It is true that all democracies have elections. It is something else to show that states with elections may not necessarily be democratic. So the other thing to take into account here is that it is not just elections that make a country democratic. As a matter of fact, oftentimes, is it possible that elections can actually bring a non-democratic government to power? Of course. Can we think of examples? Of course, when in doubt, the answer is always Hitler. If it's not North Korea, the answer is Hitler. Thank you, Godwin's law. Okay? But everybody kind of knows about that one, right? The Weimar Republic, that little interlude between Germany, World War I, and Germany, World War II, was widely regarded as one of the most democratic governments of Europe at the time. It was so bloody democratic that they voted themselves into oblivion. But yes, the fact that Hitler and the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, followed the laws, ran for local and national office. The Nazis first entered the German parliament in 1932. Hitler runs for office the following year and is appointed chancellor in 1933. There was no revolution. There was no storming of the palace. There was no coup. Hitler tried a coup 10 years earlier. Didn't get him far. Landed him in jail. He had 6 months with time to kill. What did he do in those 6 months? He wrote his little manifesto. You know, if any more people read the damn thing, they might have thought about this. And you know what? I read it. It's not the most engaging read out there. He goes off on these wild tangents, whatever. But you know, he didn't have a copy editor at the time, so this button cuts or whatever happens. The point is that yes, there are a number of cases where democratic elections can actually yield non-democratic governments. Germany, 1933, prime example of that. Although obviously Germany is not the only case, right? There are multiple cases, both in history and in the recent past, where elections have actually brought forth non-democratic parties. A more recent example in the late 80s, early 90s, when the multi-ethnic communist state of Yugoslavia, doesn't exist anymore, was breaking up, fragmenting into various republics and territories and whatever. There were political elections. There were democratic elections. And in both the succeeding states of Serbia and Croatia, illiberal political parties won. In Serbia, the communists basically changed their party name, adopted a bit more militant narratives of nationalism, and basically won back the offices that they left. So they went from the single-party communist dictatorship, they kind of reoriented themselves a little bit, ran for office, and won. And it wasn't because the Serbian electorate was virulently nationalist, but because the majority of Serbs who were voting basically voted for the people that they knew. You kind of vote for the devil you know than the devil that you don't. To kind of make it even further, the Socialist Party of Serbia, which won in 1990, came in first. Does anyone want to take a guess? Well, I bet you no one really does, but I'll ask it anyway. The selection that came in second. Don't know, no answer. Okay? So parties that came in third, fourth, and everything else like that were all these little smaller, peripheral, democratic, quasi-democratic parties. But Slobodan Milosevic was elected back into office and basically curtailed whatever democratic rights and freedoms might have manifested in the country. In neighboring Croatia, it was more obvious that the nationalists were going to win under the Croatian Democratic Union Party and its leader, Franjo Tudjman. Tudjman played to the whole sense of he's going to make Croatia great again. Okay? It's a Croatia first party, you know, all that kind of great stuff. Now, unfortunately, the last time that Croatia was made great was when it openly collaborated with the Nazis in the 1940s. So, a over-the-top romantic romance with symbols and slogans and other memorabilia from that period not only was highly insensitive to the Serb minority, but scared them shitless. In so many words, elections in both of those countries were relatively free, relatively fair, but did not bring in democratically minded governments. Now, you also have the case where the government that is democratically elected may not even be internationally recognized as such. And this is something that we don't really talk that much about, because we tend to think that a country has country has elections, they go through the process, the person wins, and everybody goes home. 9 times out of 10, that's correct. That one time that it's not is when a political party or a political movement wins an election that the international community was neither expecting nor did they want. So the paradox of the electoral fallacy is that you can practice democracy, you can do exactly that, but you run the risk of getting the rest of the world against you if you choose the wrong candidates. And you know what? We can even find that here in the United States. The more that there is this condemnation for what we had done as a relatively free and fair election, the more there's going to be a backlash. So the point to be made here is that elections don't always produce a democratic outcome. What defines a democracy? The 3 readings that we have for this section, Robert Dahl, Linz and Stepan, and Lexis de Tocqueville. In all likelihood, not going to get to Linz and Stepan and Tocqueville today. We will do so on Monday. But Robert Dahl's primary arguments, and this is the one that we start with, the structuralist, argues that a democracy is one in which there are high degrees of political contestation and high degrees of participation. And this is something that, if you were doing the Dahl reading, you remember that chart with the little squiggly arrows? You're going to come to know and love that one. Trust me, we're going to deal with that one a lot. Robert Dahl basically says high degrees of political contestation, high degrees of participation. Linz and Stepan, a country is democratic, somewhat metaphysical, when a democratic regime is behaviorally, attitudinally, and constitutionally embedded in society. So there's a certain psychological aspect about democracy, beyond just simply the structural. In all likelihood, we'll get to that on Monday. And finally, with Tocqueville, we will definitely get to Tocqueville on Monday, the uncontested and unquestioned rule of the majority. Now, he's not entirely a fan of that. He's pointing out what he sees in early 19th century America as a potential problem, right? Because one of the things that we like to constantly say about democracies is that majority wins. You have a vote, whoever gets the most votes wins. Yay, to the victor go the spoils. That's true. However, again, elections and voter attitudes do not a democracy possibly make. Okay, let's start then with the following understanding about democracy. And this is probably the most mathematical that you will ever see me get, not only in this class, but in pretty much everything else that I teach. Okay? Democracy streamlines. If we kind of look at a state, any state, and we divide that state between 2 groups, society and the state itself. So you have government on one side, and you have the rest of us on the other, the citizens, the electorate. Okay? Let's say that this is a very, very small state, just for the sake of putting it on the slide. And the state is comprised of 9 people. Citizen X, Y, Z, ABC, PDQ. Okay? And all these people, they have their opinions, they have their views, they have their values, they have their beliefs. But you know as well as I do, any fool with a soapbox can go into the proverbial Hyde Park, the proverbial Times Square, and start railing against the system. And more often than not, no one's going to take you seriously. So how do opinions coalesce into something more tangible? How do opinions coalesce? How do opinions form into something more large, something more useful for governments? What happens? What do we have here?
When a lot of people have the same opinion,
What happens?
then they all back behind it.
But again, we're just a bunch of disparate people who agree. What can we do to really seal that deal? Okay, we can form organizations, we can create platforms. What's probably the most formal type of organization within a democracy to unify those opinions?
Political party.
Very good. So we've got political parties. In this case, opinions solidify around institutions. The United States, let's just make it real simple. Let's kind of phase out column C through K on the voter ballots. And let's just look at column A and B, Republicans and Democrats. Okay? In this case, you've got two major political parties that, at least by definition, coalesce around unified views and unified values. And it is through routine elections that the majority party that wins goes into governance. Okay? And this is pretty simple stuff here. The other thing to note is that every state has a story to tell, an image to give, and what I call the state-sponsored discourse. The state-sponsored discourse, at any given time, at any given day, is basically the government that has been elected into power that reflects the will, the interests, the attitudes, and the objectives of at least 51% of the people. Does this make sense? It's pretty easy. Now, to make it democratic, the state-sponsored discourse must at all times be mindful of public perception and public opinion. Right? Because you vote someone into power. When you vote someone in, does that mean that they're in power for life? Not unless they're a Supreme Court justice. All right, so the point is that what happens if an elected official happens to run afoul of the citizenry? What can we do? All right, start from order of proper procedure to Molotov cocktail. Okay, so what's the first thing that we can do?
Try to get
Okay, the bare bones minimum, you vote them out of office. Oftentimes, it's a wonderful thing that we have in the United States. We sit around and we can't stand the people that we elect, but we never try to oust them. We just kind of wait for their term limit to go, like Christie or whoever, and we just like, okay, next time that there's a nice routine election, we go to the polls and we vote for somebody else. And that's it. And it's kind of like a referendum on the president. The president loses re-election. That's kind of embarrassing. Okay? So you can vote them out of power. Now what happens if the person, I don't know, refuses to leave? Doesn't happen before, but it's the first time for everything. What happens if the person refuses to leave? What can we do? Again, remember, state-sponsored discourse must always match at least 51% of the views of the citizenry.
Are we assuming that that one individual is kind of like has the backing of the whole state?
Let's just say if the individual has the backing of 51% of the state, it's a shaky approval rating, but it's going to be okay. What happens if popular dissent changes? Well, this leads to, there can be protests, there can be active resistance to general strikes. At some point, you've all got that one friend who was waiting for doomsday to happen. We all got that one friend, get the Molotov cocktail down, And, in the United States, we don't really have that. In other parts of the world, in Egypt, in the former communist world, we do. Right? We've got people that will storm the proverbial governmental palace and throw the bums out. So the point about democracy being streamlined is that there must be this constant dialectic between both society and the state. If there is equilibrium between the two, democracy is harmonized, and the rules and procedures continue as if there was no problems. The minute that there are changes here, if there are changes in the attitudes of the citizenry, it stands to reason that there will become an election cycle, changes in the government. And if the government is somehow behind the times, it is likely that the citizens will vote them out of office. Again, this is really nothing that you don't know already, but it's just simply a way of getting the point across about what a democracy is. Okay. In the remaining time that we have, I do want to get to Robert Dahl. Okay? The main aspect of the Dahl reading is this idea that democracy is measured by two critically important axioms. the degree of participation and the degree of contestation. Okay? So I'm taking this directly from the reading. So participation is on the x-axis, contestation is on the y. So at the bottom left-hand corner, we have 0, 0. Okay, that's North Korea. At the upper corner there, we have high degrees of participation, high degrees of contestation. I don't know, some like uber democratic Scandinavian country, or maybe Amish country, or the New York City subway, or whatever it is, right? Something that rarely exists in real life, okay, or can exist beyond 100 people. Okay. Starting at the lower left-hand corner, and this is directly taken from Dahl. Okay, he calls this closed hegemonies. Okay, closed hegemonies. We start with degree 0. Very little to no degree of contestation. Very little to no degree of participation. So full-blown dictatorship, some form of absolutist governance. Now, Dahl is both a political scientist and an historian. Good combination. And he notes that the development of modern democracies do take a number of evolutionary routes. The most common, the most conservative, but the most stable route towards democracy is the following. The first route, the development of some nascent socio-political contestation within the country. But, and this is very, very important, amid a very little degree of participation. So we are talking about 10 to 20% of the absolute most of the population involves itself in politics. Now, this is more historical than contemporary. So we're talking 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. Maybe at the absolute earliest, or absolute latest, early 20th century. These are your socio-political intellectuals who go through the proper education channels to become civil servants. They become the doctors, the lawyers, the jurists, the statesmen that sort of inherit the country. These are what we'll call the urban-dwelling intellectual bourgeois, to sound a little Marxist here. Okay? Now that means that the remaining 80 to 90% of the population is off the political grid. Now, who are the majority at this time that form 80 to 90% of the population? Who are they? Who can they possibly be? Average worker, middle, lower class? Well, actually, that's your middle class right there. But who else could it possibly be? Who really forms the majority of like early modern countries? Farmers, right? The peasants, who are off the grid, and they don't care. They couldn't care less about what happens in the capital, right? They're not interested. They're off the grid, and the high pretentious bourgeoisie are happy to keep them off the grid. Because what the hell does a farmer know? Now, these are your founding fathers. Same thing happened in the United States. Right? U.S. government was founded, you know, I can use a little smattering of both mythology and historical fact, by your founding fathers. Okay? Was the U.S. Constitution designed by popular committee? Dear God, no. Okay? The U.S. Constitution was largely designed by people that could fit in one half of this section of the classroom. I'm pretty certain all of them were white, male, land-owning aristocrats. You know, your Jeffersons, your Madisons, your Hamiltons, all that kind of jazz. A couple of Adams in there, you know, John and probably Sam, you know, he brought the beer. So, you know, the point that I'm trying to make is that it is an elite-driven vocation. And what Dahl is saying is that this is actually important, even though the most extreme case of this leads to competitive oligarchy. A competitive oligarchy could be democratic. It could be, provided that your founding fathers and your elites are enlightened enough and think progressively enough. But it's not really a participatory democracy. It's more like a series of philosopher kings. You know, the stuff that Fareed Zakaria would just absolutely love to have. Okay? Now, the second route, and this one is a bit more dangerous. It doesn't happen all that time, but when it does, you kind of want to be on the lookout. The second route is that Contestation remains limited, but for reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, participation just expands. Maybe there's somebody that takes control of power. Maybe it's a king or an emperor or some kind of demagogue, and uses popular, charismatic authority as a way of claiming power. Again, it doesn't happen all that often, but it's enough to mention. Scott? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, if we were to note the extreme end of this, inclusive hegemonies, the best example of that is Nazi Germany and other fascist-like systems. Fascism, and we're going to talk about fascism in the second half of this, fascism does have a certain degree of democracy in it. It's weird and it's very unsettling. It's not the same as totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is there, closed genders. Fascism is there. Okay? Now the third route, and the one that every so often some states will get, is a little bit of both. Notice how I did the deliberate squiggly line there? I don't know why Dahl did it, but I'm just copying it. That's PowerPoint animation, though. I'm so happy. You get what's called polyarchy. Now, a student just beforehand very eruditely asked me, what's a polyarchy? A polyarchy is a word that Robert Dahl made up. It's it's like an uber democracy because it represents significantly high degrees of contestation and significantly high degrees of participation. More often than not, these four extremes don't exist. But we're using them as extremes to get the point across. Okay? There is not a country on earth in which every citizen of the country votes every single time. And there's not a single country on earth in which every issue, whether it is minute or specific or abstract, is debated upon. But what are some examples? Okay? Because it's polyarchy that we want to get to. Okay? Okay. What are some examples? The lower left-hand quadrant, and mind you, this entire space is where countries can get plotted. Okay? So the lower level, the lower left-hand level, are those fully hegemonic states out there. Okay? Your North Koreas, Saudi Arabias, Turkmenistans, Cubans, just to name a few. Okay? Again, play Freedom House. 7s across the board. Okay? That one's really easy. But what I'm going to do is for the other three quadrants, I'm deliberately using democracies. Now here's the thing. The upper left and the lower right can fluctuate. They can be democracies and they can be non-democracies. I'm going to use democracies to kind of show that you can still get away with a few things. Obviously, countries with higher degrees of contestation than participation, again, moving towards your competitive oligarchies, tend to be states that are competitive within subnational organizations, but are hegemonic at the national level. So you've got local elections, which oftentimes can be contested. National elections usually tend to be foregone conclusions. Traditionally, this was Great Britain. In fact, Great Britain plays into the archetypical model of a country that first develops contestation until there is a major social revolution to start including the rest of the people. We'll talk about that momentarily. Later on, probably the two best examples of this are two communist countries. China, which still functions this way today, and Yugoslavia, which up until its dissolution was moving in this direction. China does have elections at the local level. And yes, you can only vote for people within the Chinese Communist Party, but there are a number of cases within China where local elections are quite competitive among people who may not argue about party ideology. They couldn't care less about that. In this day and age, competitive local elections in China are all about money, all about economics. Now, at the top level, make no mistake about it, the Chinese Communist Party runs the show. And there is no challenge to that. Internally, on the other hand, the party can be internally competitive. The same thing with Yugoslavia. during the 60s and 70s, the various republics of Yugoslavia, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, Macedonia, and Montenegro, they all were able to, for the large part, decide among themselves about how to plan the economy, how to operate politics, but at the federal level, make no mistake, the Communist Party ran the show. What about those countries that have higher degrees of participation than contestation? Okay? In this case, we have competition at the national level, but hegemony at the local. Here I include the United States, India, and Italy. The United States, and the last presidential election, which lasted for 2 frickin' years, showed us a couple of things. The most competitive seat in the country is still the White House. It is still open game between Democrats and Republicans. But is it fair enough to say that at more state and local levels, there are states in this country that we know for a fact are red, and they're going to stay red for the indefinite future? And are there states that are blue, that are going to stay blue for the indefinite future? Okay? Which state is New Jersey, a red state or a blue state? Blue. It's hard to believe that it's a blue state because there are large parts of New Jersey that kind of remind you that you're basically in the Confederacy. Okay? There are lots of Trump signs that I saw in Edison, but I was pretty comfortable voting and writing in Bernie, knowing that it was going to go Hillary. I was pretty certain that Hillary was going to get New Jersey, and she did. Okay? New York went Hillary, New England went Hillary, right? That's what it is. California, Wisconsin, California, Oregon, and Washington. Right? And I was watching the elections, as pretty much you were, and I'm thinking to myself, if Hillary doesn't get this by 11 o'clock at night Eastern Standard Time, she's not going to get this. She's got to get the Pacific Coast, which we know is going to go. We know for a fact. What's the likelihood of Trump actually campaigning in California and winning? Like, no. It's the likelihood of Hillary campaigning in Idaho. There are Democrats that live in Idaho, hard to believe, but would she go there? Probably not. So my point is, and how about even in New Jersey? How many of you come from certain counties or certain towns where you know it's been held lock, stock, and barrel by one party or the other? Okay? I'm from this little slice of heaven called Edison. And Edison, how many of you are from that? Anybody know about Edison? Edison, you know what we are? We are a single-party dictatorship. Did you know that? We don't even have a Republican Party. We lost the Republican Party when I think like a diner burned down by mysterious reasons or whatever. We don't even have, we have the Democratic Party and that's it. Okay? And maybe when Bill Stevens runs as an independent, he's kind of like the, standing in as the Republican Party will be the independents. Okay? But yet at the other end of this spectrum, you've got Middletown, which no matter how many times the FBI comes in and arrests the Republican leadership, they still control local politics. So in this case, you've got this example where democracy does work, but contestation is, there's only a few, right? Even when you're campaigning for the White House, right? There's a few swing states that you have to really care about, right? And it's for like that one time every 4 years where people give a damn about Ohio. And that's it, right? That people care about the interior of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is purple simply because of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Then you got the Amish Empire in the middle. That just goes red. Okay? So you've got a few swing states that are competitive, but other than that, there's at least 35 out of the 50 states that if you're either one party or the other, you don't even bother campaigning because we know it's going to go one way or the other. Okay, so what's the happy hippy-dippy promised lands? The fully liberalized, fully competitive regimes, all right? This is like Bernie Sanders land, yo. Okay? This is Finland, New Zealand, Iceland. I'll even throw in Amish country. Trust me, the Amish are more socially democratic than you could ever possibly imagine. That's democracy, okay? High degrees of participation, high degrees of diversity, high degrees of contestation. Okay, in the remaining few minutes that we have, okay? There's a couple of questions that I want to leave you with as sort of a cliffhanger, okay? Dahl's assessment of democracy, okay? It's probably the last big hurdle that we've got. A state is democratic when the costs of repression are high and the costs of participation are low, okay? A state is democratic when it costs you not just monetarily, but it costs you electorally if you throw in the riot police to quell the dissension. So again, the point to look at here is that the threshold is sort of like in the middle, right? Once you pass that threshold, where the cost of toleration go down and the cost of repression go up, you're democratic. So play this just like Dahl's charts. Down here, the cost of repression are low, the cost of toleration are high. There's Little Kim, there's Best Korea. All the way in the upper right-hand corner, the cost of repression are excessively high, and the cost of toleration are excessively low. That's Iceland. Why do I say Iceland? Because do you remember a couple of months ago this thing came out called the Panama Papers? Remember the Panama Papers? There was like this big, wide-scale international money laundering fraud, whatever it is. You got to think to yourself, oh, there's a whole bunch of political leaders that should get sacked for this. And most of them kind of didn't because, well, we'll just switch the thing. Russia. No? There's only one person that got sacked. That was the Prime Minister of Iceland who resigned himself. He was like, oh, my name's on that list. Well, I've lost the trust of my people. I'm going to resign. People were like, we weren't even expecting you to, but good for you. Look at that. Good for you. You know what? I almost respect you. Oh, come on, stay a little bit. You were so honest. Okay, that's Iceland. Okay, so with that said, all right, the big question is, and this is where I'm going to leave you. Big question is, how does a state therefore evolve, grow, or transition from either competitive oligarchies or inclusive hegemonies to full-fledged polyarchies? How does a state evolve from one strength or weakness to the other? How does a state, in so many words, become democratic? Because if the usual path of transition is either one or the other, how do we get up there, right? How do we get up there? That's the $64,000 question. All right, the big question is this. States can develop from competitive oligarchies to polyarchies. They can develop from inclusive hegemonies to polyarchies. What takes place here? And that's the big thing. What happens here? What needs to happen in order for one to move to the other? Okay? And I'll leave you with this question so you can finish writing that. But we will start to answer that question on Monday when we examine Lindsay Stefan.